critical engagement with contemporary art. Share. Look at all that. Look at that. I was watching Dear White People. Okay. Right, so the homeschool curriculum, it's been going on for, this is the third year, and we have a multimedia curriculum featuring exhibitions, artist talks, panels, different kinds of performative engagements. Like we recently had Sidonia O'Neill debut a performance called Modus Tollens, where they sat silently in a Reed College lecture hall and projected themselves doing a kind of automatic writing exercise about the logical argument of modus tollens, which is just one of the set of logical arguments. And then we had a class called Karaoke by Keon Gaskin that was awesome. He presented a work that was very participatory and boozy. It was called Karaoke, and it was therapy karaoke. So we all got drunk and sang and gave each other positive notes anonymously on paper. So we do stuff like that. But then we also have regular like art classes. I didn't study art. I come from a linguistics background. Let me just talk about myself later. First, let me just start this slide. And the bathroom is over there. It's the first door on your right. And then there's snacks and beer and stuff. Feel free to dig into that. So, non-art, this is my class, the first session. Here's a summary. We're going to screen 3 videos. I'm going to give a little bit of a lecture. And then if we want, or if I want, we're going to have a discussion. So, these videos are both related and unrelated. They're just things, 2 of them are not by me and I just enjoy them a lot. And then the third is by me and it's the most related to the class. It kind of provides an overview of the violence of modernism as well as my practice and what motivates it. So this is Bally Baby.
I've been in the backseat thinking about you and me, baby. I'm not alone. Where did we go wrong? Where did the stars go when the morning comes? I've been in the backseat moving very fast. I'm staring at the window, watching the world rush by, watching you fall behind. From the backseat of my car, won't you let me, baby? Won't you let me, baby? Won't you trust me? Tell me where did we go? Won't you let me, baby? Won't you trust me? These feelings got me deadly. Tell me, keep playing along, play along. Should I lie along? Try to hit my phone whenever I'm alone. She said she liked my tone. I tell her, baby, keep on. Tell her, baby, come on. We take it to the we can't walk outside because I ain't that you can't just these bitches, they are too close. They tuning in like I'm an episode. I've been in the backseat thinking about you and me, baby, all night long. Where did we go wrong? Where did the stars go when the morning comes? I've been in the backseat moving very fast. Watching the world rush by, watching you fall behind. From the backseat of my mind. Obviously, your material love is so imperial. Love is when I hear you love and how I'm feeling you love with every bit of you. I cannot get rid of you. Tell me what you wanna do. You just came up out the blue. Tell me what went wrong. We're screaming on a song. We never got along. You lost me, now I'm gone. Hitting like a bomb. We never got along. You played all along. So tell me right or wrong. You feeling down a rainy day. Go from LA back to the A. No, I can't conversate. And let what's happened to my day. I'm in the backseat feeling great. I've been in the backseat thinking about you and me, baby, all night long. Where did we go wrong? Now every fucking touch me. It doesn't feel as strong as it used to. I've been in the backseat thinking about you and me. Baby, how long? Where did we go wrong? Where did the stars go? When the morning comes, living in the backseat, we're pulling your fast car, staring out the window, watching the world go by. Do you fall behind on the backseat of my mind?
So good. I like that song a lot and the video. But I guess the reason I chose to play it in this context is because it's a radical shift for her style. She has, up to this point, done trap. And she has a kind of personality switch vibe going on with her work. Like, the trap artist was Bally Brazy. And then this new kind of pop punk style that she's doing is called Baylor Swift. And the reason I'm playing it is because I want us to think about a radical recalibration in terms of our relationship to art that's as radical as this shift from trap to pop punk. It's not only radical, but it makes complete sense. Those two things have a lot in common. And then I also want us to think about nostalgia, and this nostalgia for like early 2000s mall culture and emo and pop punk and all the things that were big around then in scene culture. So, second video is by dear friend Hamishi Farah. He's a Somali Australian artist. And I'm playing this because we played this at the Homeschool launch back in 2015. And it deals with a lot of the same issues that I deal with in my work. It's just a great video, great explanation of the ways in which marginality can become institutional. And just some great thoughts about appropriation as well. Both cultural appropriation and appropriation in the artistic sense of using found materials. And it's from 2014.
The tree could be albino. I think it only really grows in warm climates. It looks like most gardens can get past the second largest branch, perfectly spelling out the word patience in proper plate pocket. Before white people came to Australia with their photocopiers and anxiety, nature discovered placid motivational posters. Billy passes the distinctive tree arriving at the clearing for the fourth time today. Unaffected by the familiarity of mountain territory, she keeps a persistent pace, knee to jaw at each step. A dirt tracked marked by commuters exiting the platform at a paced pathway, infrastructure can't keep up. People will prevail and Billy is very happy. Everything is white, the way things should be, in the snow. Billy is walking, every snowflake is unique. Who cares? There are rules in storytelling. One of them is that Billy is a robust copy. Billy turns to the camera, speaking directly to the audience on painting. Try to have everything on the surface, revealing everything but revealing nothing at the same time. This is where the whole question of the sign, the signifier, and the meaning comes into play. All these words are available to read. The way the image operates as a text should be clear enough so that people can engage in a textual reading of the work. Yet the work should resist the need to be interpreted. That's not where the value of a work resides. Billy's breed and colour being changed to maintain anonymity. Billy is quoting someone, but has decided not to attribute the text to them. By doing so, Billy has changed the breed and colour of the text, attributing it to the world. The world is looking at Billy. This goes back to the idea of the context as a time frame of sorts. But would you say that with painting in particular, images exist almost completely outside of time? That's what allows them to remain useful over time, I think. While my installed shots are distinctively 2014 resolution and composition, 10 seconds of silence. Luckily, I can document the paintings again and again in the 2015, 2019, 2022 standards. I recently bought a used MacBook Pro with a Retina screen from Darren, a government employee I met on Gumtree. We met at a KFC in the outer Melbourne suburb, Moonee Ponds. He arrived in a green Grand Cherokee with his tennis gear in the back ready for a quick play afterwards. His hands were visibly shaking the whole transaction, fumbling through the "Where are you from originally?" diatribe as he takes a photo of my driver's license for scam protection. Darren certainly did not expect a straight-up nigger like Mishi Farah to give him $2,000. Darren knows that theft is an archetypically powerful tool of resistance and non-compliance for the black man. I think it is necessary to ignore authorship to create a space for something to become interesting again. I think ignorance of copyright is beneficial to my health and happiness. Aurelia Go. Darren doesn't know happiness is a very useful tool of non-compliance for the black man. The marker for a successful stolen image is its status as an aphorism in its new context, rendering its previous incarnation as insufficient, artless, insignificant. Women and brown and black people make them best white men because they are affected enough to appear unaffected. Unaffectedness has lived a long life as a glamorous personal trait. Its attainability is shrouded by the self-conflicting nature of striving for such a trait. It is a signifier of experience or indifference, the residual remains of a previous pain, a commodifiable pain, as a common perpetrator desires the embodiment of his dominance to further escape himself. What do you think needs to be changed about the way black men are policed in America? Young Thug says, leave that up with the critics and the laws and all that other shit. We that lifestyle. We having fun. We iced out. We having money. That's how we're doing it. Rap music is broad. The performers become agents of the same structure that has oppressed them. And when moral high ground is life or death, to be so proud of your vulnerability without resignation is the road to immortality. I think this is how rap can be so delicate. Rap music is 50 years ahead of contemporary art. Despite their positioning as structural opposites, cynicism can still take the form of unaffectedness. Systemic of entitlement, cynicism is highly undesirable trait in artwork as it resists unaffectedness, subservience, while itself is a subordinated response to a condition or situation. Cynicism lends itself to didacticism, a stippling quality that doesn't possess the malleability that contemporary art's ruling class requires. An exhibition concerning but aesthetically unfazed by global issues, unaffected by trends in its irreverent participation in them. This is the pinnacle of commercially seductive exhibition making today. The best way to forget someone is to name a building after them. The best way to forget an issue is to own a beautiful object concerning it, but aesthetically independent of it. In opposition to a ruling majority, didacticism by marginal practitioners is commonly lauded and invited by Australian institutions. Public galleries, Come At Me Bro, Come At Me Sis, commissioning of marginal didacticism is deftly mistaken for institutional critique. However, this misreading correctly positions a ruling majority within the institution, delineating marginal aesthetics as subgenre of institutional critique, co-opted into the Museo program to satiate and alleviate a ruling class with minimal engagement. A backseat nod akin to a museum liking the article you posted on cultural appropriation, more bang for the buck, promoting this didacticism and keeping the public's engagement with marginal aesthetics separate from contemporary art dialogue while quenching the thirst of guilt. BDSM, because white people have been naughty. Young thug.
Leave that over with the critics and the laws and all that other shit. We having fun, we iced out, we having money. That's how we doing.
We're having money. That's how we're doing it. It's 2013. You're across the road from the Atherton Gardens Housing Commission. A talk on the current Somali-themed exhibition at Gertrude Contemporary. Then director of Gertrude, Alexi Glass-Cantor, is proud to finally bring the wood into the gallery. But hey, it's not personal. Afterwards, I sent her an email that can be paraphrased to, I am ready and willing to be your little nigger. Sometimes survival is the most profound thing you can do as a black man, but it's not really something white people can get behind. It's early mid-2014. I am participating in Gertrude Contemporary's A4 PDF, a curatorial project by then studio residents George Edgerton Warburton and Agatha Gottsnake. I am proposing a small press release for the upcoming show with a fine print in which Gertrude self-reflexively acknowledges its whiteness and position in the ruling class. Now director of Gertrude, Emma Cremings sits backwards on a chair talking to me, begging for me to critique the institution. Please, Hamishi. There is an African-shaped gap in the Australian art landscape, and I am not here to fill it unless I am addressing Australian Council. A few hundred metres out of the clearing, Billy is darting her feet around the dense foliage fallen from the snow-depressed canopy above. Fully exerting herself, Billy's facial features seem to almost mould into a more aerodynamic, conical shape. Set designers are the new commercial contemporary artists. The corporatization of the artist after Web 2.0 frequently resists the neutrality of the white cube. Establishing an environment and context for the work becomes the work. Exhibition as ensemble. Artists as exhibition makers creating a beautiful space as a set to their narrative, tangential to their being. Like the aestheticization of a brand through advertising, the gallery, objects, lighting, context, and artists by live in the documentation. Rendering art objects are horrible, ephemeral, subservient to the limitless, immaterial aesthetic, personality, or feeling that the artists trade in. At the end of each season of the popular reality TV show Survivor, important objects from the series and set are auctioned off. As it is supplanted into various web layouts and recontextualized through post-production, the exhibition's documentation becomes as immortal as the JPEGs or TIFFs that hold it. Why work so hard for a 6-week exhibition when you can have a show that lasts forever? This goes back to the idea of the context as a time frame of sorts. But would you say that with a painting in particular, images exist almost completely out of time? What happens to a work's essence if it cannot be sufficiently translated into JPEGs? What happens to an Australian artist? Are exhibitions any more date material than a Wi-Fi signal? A corporation will most likely never tell you to go fuck yourself. There are 1,420 unique lonely images for every human alive today. Humans are the safest animal on the planet, and painting is the safest investment. Amishi.
Dope. Okay. I'm gonna open this beer and then play mine. Hope you guys are bored. So with this video, I took a text that I wrote in 2016 and turned it into captions, kind of. I outsourced different paragraphs to different people and had them read the text as if they were me. My voice is also in this at certain points. So I kind of see it as a communal reading. And as, I guess, aside from the issues discussed in the text, I also see it as an embodiment of the creator as a kind of debt to their community. This is an idea from Wilson Harris. I'm going to explain Wilson Harris later. He's a great writer that just passed. But, yeah, so this is Notes on the Garage Residency 2018.
I grew up in the Bronx, undocumented. Now I make ephemeral work in Portland using whatever's at hand, which mostly goes undocumented.
To clean up its image as a drudgy egghead in haven in the wake of 2 fatal student overdoses. Reed College arrested me and my roommate on campus the day before Valentine's Day, 2012. It was touted as a successful drug dealer bust. We were both evicted from campus housing. He was expelled, I was suspended for a year. I experienced a period of housing instability, eventually moving into a detached garage in back of the punk house called the Blue Velvet, where Reed students formerly lived. After about a year and a half of living there, I decided to call my habitation an artist residency. I still live and work here today.
While my parents primarily just type URLs into their Google search bar, I knew that at any moment their digital literacy could increase and lead them to search for me. I didn't want them seeing results pointing to my arrest and subsequent court-ordered outpatient rehabilitation. So I decided to brand myself as a poet and artist in order to manipulate the search results for my name. I started a new Facebook account, began submitting work to wherever, and put in my year of sobriety in order for my felony charges to be dismissed. I got lucky. My output had slowed dramatically since high school, but I felt I could still identify and live as a poet-artist despite barely making work. What began as concealment of crime via SEO became a sincere fascination with ephemera, disappearance, and what it means to be performative. I can tell it is sincere because when aesthetic work amounts to nothing is when I feel the most grateful. Daily jogs with my mom for a month last time I was home in the Bronx, an abandoned flurry of emails, a one-day installation of found objects in detritus, and a recently vacated room. A failed attempt to change this house's name from the Blue Velvet to the Rossellini. Documentation can always be manufactured, but for me, nothing beats the specific joy of a work disappearing forever, sweetly remaining only when invoked in language.
This fascination developed in tandem with the precarity of my income and housing, to the extent that I sometimes saw the odd jobs and freelance gigs I cobbled together for survival as a facet of my practice, since they also sometimes altered the search engine results or my name. I finished rehab and returned to Reed to graduate in 2014 in linguistics, but couldn't find work until January 2016. My income oscillated between $4,000 to $8,000 a year, and I worked variously as a janitor, social media marketer, SEO copywriter, small press managing editor, data entry drone, research assistant, and transcriptionist. Scarcity seemed to engender a slippage between inhabiting a space and making a work, in a way that was easier for me to embody than to explain. Treating wage work as aesthetic practice was a lazy way of answering the question if, quote, there is no art without laziness, end quote, Stilanovich, how could I be an artist when poverty is so expensive and labor intensive? I couldn't afford to be lazy, to sit around and think and write and walk without worry. I needed to eat.
It's worth pushing back against the idealization of laziness. Aristotle to Lafargue many praises of idleness situate work as a demeaning activity reserved for the unfree. Lafargue says, quote, the Greeks in their era of greatness had only contempt for work. Their slaves alone were permitted to labor. Free man knew only exercises for the body and mind, unquote. As a person who comes from slaves, I can't abide this kind of framework, not least because it erases the reality of slaves across history using slow labor, bad labor, refusal of labor, and other similar lazy tactics as resistance to their masters. Not only this, but also because it flattens slavery and its afterlife just to forced work. And this is only one aspect of its infinite violence. This formulation of laziness doesn't offer any useful critique against the idea of work. It just condemns slaves and workers.
This is simply a transposition of the worship of work made possible by secularization. As a de-Christianized colonial construct, Western art, like capitalism and socialism, treats work as salvation, whereas it was formerly a curse. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. 2 Thessalonians 3:10, NIV. Secularization released work from its association as punishment for original sin, allowing capitalists and communists alike to reconfigure it as a blessing, a right, a path for redemption from starvation and squalor, a way to become human. Treating laziness as salvation, as Stalinovic says, the mother of perfection, is only an inversion of this framework. Whoever is not lazy is not an artist. Analogously, when a person becomes legible as an artist, and when an object, process, or idea becomes legible as art, from what are they being saved?
Discourses of work and laziness both often rely on the same underlying concept: dehumanization. Whether one takes the capitalist and socialist position where work is humanizing, or the anti-work position where laziness is humanizing, the contrast is clear. One wants to be human, not inhuman. Since settler colonialism positions Black folks outside the human category, the discourse of labor thus does not explain Black presence, Black labor, or Black use in white settler nation states, as Tiffany Lethabo King argues. She opts instead for a framework of fungibility to analyze the ways the settler state uses Blackness to meet, quote, desires beyond those of labor and profit.
Just as the labor analytic is inadequate for explaining the role the Middle Passage and its afterlife play in capitalism's development, so too is a laziness or non-work analytic. And the deficiencies of such humanizing discourses carry over to the aesthetic realm, not only falling short in the context of explaining Black art, but also manifesting as tokenized inclusion, which reifies white settler institutions. Humanist assimilation plays a concealing role, the same way the concept of the wage conceals the violent, fundamental devaluation of the unwaged activity on which it relies. Brooklyn artist Winslow LaRoche has a great term for the position of rejecting such frameworks: the post-artist. At least since Hegel, the idea of the end of art has served to critique the development of aesthetics, as well as the relation between making and thinking. For Hegel, the West is beyond the stage at which art is the supreme mode of our knowledge of the absolute, because art's dependence on the sensuous caused it to fall behind thought. In a similar vein, Alan Caprow deployed the term post-art to describe conceptual and post-conceptual work which, in ostensible contrast to modernist aesthetics of high art as ritual escape from culture, blurred the line between banal life and high art. For Caprow, non-art is more art than art. This seems true, given the far higher aesthetic potential of that which is not art in comparison to that which has been trapped in as art. Unable to return to the mundane or the theoretical, frozen and hoarded like a bauble in a mausoleum. But this blurred boundary easily accommodates market logic and is itself dependent on a laziness analytic.
As opposed to Hegel and Caprow, a LaRochian post-art concept is inflected by the Middle Passage and its afterlife, allowing it to question the valorization of objects that exist in a purgatory between commoditized art and negatory non-art. Precisely the frontal position the slave occupies under white supremacy, when passing through the rouge de re, violent value circulation towards false citizenship. Instead, by dismantling the typical work and anti-work discourses on which analyses, tokenizing inclusions, and dismissals of Black aesthetics often rely. Roche's post-art allows us to argue that far from living in a time after art, the West has not yet actually reached the conditions for art. All the West knows as art since the Enlightenment is an ecology of criteria for inclusion, which relies on the colonial subsumption of Black and brown aesthetics.
The conditions for art as a fundamentally not functional or non-utilitarian, an endeavor will never emerge as long as art's erasure of its own debt to black and brown practice continues.
Descendants of the Middle Passage have long known that all sociality and aesthetic practice is always already subsumed into the commodity form under capitalism. Since this is precisely what was done to our ancestors and continues today in the prison industrial complex, where slavery is legal as a punishment for crime.
These days, weed is legal in Oregon. And as of June 2016, I work full-time as an IT compliance analyst and office assistant. I recently contributed work to a group show at Reed College for their annual Arts Week that nothing happened. As I acclimate to my first real moment of financial stability, however short-lived, I can't help but bemusingly wonder. My life is, for now, no longer precarious. What does that mean for my art? From a post-artistic perspective, all it does is allow me to buy materials for once, and to more fully understand that I may just not have a practice the way that people usually do. Stability doesn't necessarily require a shift away from ephemeral gestures. Few will deny that ephemerality gains artistic cachet primarily in relation to crutches, true or imagined marginality over explanation, possessive. Both sidestep the fundamentally middle-class anxiety that the image of the waged artist evokes in a marketized landscape where it is both necessary and anathema. To end on the third sidestep, I'm happy just sharing my money with friends and family.
There we go. All right, so that's the essay. Hopefully it provides decent context. But in case it doesn't, let me get off of this slide. Here we go. In case it doesn't, here's some information about me. I'm a poet and artist from the Bronx. I live and work in a garage in Southeast Portland since 2012. I work with text, ephemera, and photography. And my process includes not making work, magical thinking, the critical paradox, and the ritual aspects of aesthetics. By the critical paradox, I mean this understanding of critique as always parasitic to its object, never having independent value, just always attached to something else in a vampiric or parasitic way. And then also the critical paradox of representing the object of critique. How do we make a good critique if we don't replicate the object of that critique? And if we're replicating it, aren't we reifying it? Right, so it's this question of like, I guess the best way to put it is if oppression went away, would you still have a job? And if the answer is no, then you're not doing actual critique at all. You're just producing content. I have 3 books, List of Consonants from Bottle Cap Press in 2015, Transtrender from Quimérica Books in 2016, and Incalculable Loss is forthcoming from the Institute for New Connotative Action in the summer. And then some recent work. I had a duo show with my friend Christopher Paul Jordan at the Art Gym in Merrillhurst, curated by Ashley Stoll-Myers, and it's called Place Names. I also had a group show with Kiki Nicole and a project that I co-facilitate with Jamandria, who is over there. Jamandria Marnice Harris and I co-facilitate another project called Black Apotrope, which is a living multimedia anthology of Black queer tendencies and processes. And apotrope means an object, context, or process that wards off evil. So we're interested in medium non-conforming or medium antagonistic approaches to warding off evil. And that show was at the Paragon Gallery on the PCC Cascade campus on North Killingsworth. And I had a solo show at Open Signal, the Portland Community Media Center, in January called Transit. And I also had that video that I just showed published in Accessions, as well as some other essays. Oh, I've done stuff happens. Here's a video of place names to give you a sense of what a non-artistic approach to making work looks like, I guess. For this show, I created a replica of the garage that I live in. I wanted people to walk into the space and feel like they were me in a sense. It's not really art, it's just a replica of the garage, but whatever people do in there could be art. So in the same way that in my own garage, I work. And then Christopher had some paintings and a video. This is Christopher's work. It's really good. He painted on fiberglass and then spray painted the paintings. Spray paint aerosol degrades fiberglass, so it created this beautiful detritus-like effect. That's the film. This is a junkyard that Christopher lives in near. It's really important to his practice. That's the fake garage. It's a lot cleaner than the real thing. Tote bag from Melanie Stevens. Blanket by Bunny Rogers, and the tote bag by Damien Deneage. There's a banner outside. You can see it from the window of the garage. There you go. Me explaining my art practice. The idea being that me explaining my art practice is like a conspiracy theory or something. Okay, so let's dive into the lecture. Hopefully you guys enjoyed those videos. If not, I don't care. But 3 kinds of non-art. There's the literal definition, which is, what people don't call art. I'll get into the paradoxes of that in a second. There's Alan Caprow's definition. Non-art is art that blurs the boundary between art and life. He's of the opinion that non-art is more art than art, as he says in a 1971 essay. And then a third definition, Lorwellian definition of non-art. It's analogous to his concept of non-philosophy, which operates simultaneously as an investigation of philosophy's uncritical assumptions, a rejection of transcendence in favor of immanence, and an attempt to use the tools of philosophy without ascribing to the ideology of it, which is problematic, to be fair. The idea that we can use tools that come from an ideology without subscribing to it. I would say that really the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, as Audre Lorde says, but it's a matter of opinion, I guess. And also a matter of necessity. I mean, sometimes we don't have time to wait for tools that don't have blood on them, so we have to live and survive and stuff. Funny comic from, I don't know, it provokes the age-old question, what is art? I can tell you what it's not cheap. Okay, so let's start with the literal definition, which in itself is kind of a paradox. The simplest definition of art is that which people call art, and the simplest definition of non-art is that which people don't call art. Why is this a paradox? Because there are objects that different people will call different things. Some will say it's art, some will say it's not. It's just best to accept that this thing is always up in the air, and it doesn't really matter that much. We just accept that some people call it art, some people don't. So I'm avoiding the paradoxes by just taking it at face value. So through discourse, administrative, and managerial prowess, the subsumption of sociality into aesthetics and other tactics, contemporary art is characterized by its ongoing expansion into the non-artistic. So I guess since 1911 or 1912, white art has been undergoing a process of expansion or subsumption, right? It's a kind of analog to colonization. It continues expanding into everything that's not considered art. And so all that's left is a kind of managerial process, right? Artist as manager. And contemporary art's relationship to literal non-art is often denigrated. So we hear people say things like, my 5-year-old could do this. How is this art? About things that parabolically approach non-art, but are still art based on institutional definitions. But then also it's important to note that literal non-art also characterizes the labor of gallerists, preparators, maintenance, and other staff, etc. That labor is what gives art its value and definition, if we think of it from that angle of class consciousness, I guess. And that's non-art unless it's transformed into art. So this is kind of a great example of the paradox I'm talking about. This non-art labor can be transformed into art the way that Muriel Achilles did it in her practice of maintenance art. She's been the artist in residence for the sanitation department since the 70s. And the presentations of her work in institutions have involved things like cleaning the space, cleaning a specific vitrine, this kind of manual labor. This video to me is just really funny and absurd and kind of exemplifies like the discourse of contemporary art right now. At the Hammer Museum, there's an exhibition called Stories of Almost Everyone right now. And the concept of this exhibition is, how do we approach discourse-based art after the linguistic turn, where ordinary objects are embodied or are imbued with narrative meaning based on different tactics like framing or wall text or whatever. So Joe McHale and Will Ferrell went to go see this exhibition, and we're, characteristically stupid, but I find it really funny how stupid they are, because it really makes me agree with them in a certain sense. Like, who cares that normal objects are imbued with narrative function? That's not that special. It's also something that's been going on for a lot longer than this exhibition pretends it has. Because the narrative is that this started in the 60s with conceptual art, but that's a falsehood, obviously. And I'll go into that later. I have a whole section about the violence of modernism and stuff.
Okay, we just need one more thing from you and then we're done for the day.
Okay.
Can you do a VIP tour? Just 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay. It's great to be here at the Hammer Museum. Thank you for having me. It's called Stories of Almost Everyone.
Is it working?
There are stories being told in these rooms. That's a definite. Almost everyone? I don't know about it.
True.
I'd say 5 to 10 people. The stories of 5 to 10 people. That's what should be called.
This is a work by Darren Bader. It's a facsimile of a John McCracken. McCracken was someone who's known for projecting narratives into kind of minimalist form. In Darren's case, it's full of kind of junk.
So if we cracked it open, right?
There'd be
A
stuff inside.
pinata of sorts.
You know that there's something inside, but we don't necessarily know what's in it.
That's killing. It's driving me crazy.
We all know what's inside.
Cocaine.
This is a work by Jason Dodge, and they're works where pillows that have only been slept on by acrobats.
Yeah, this is really good. I just like hanging around circuses and said, would you mind
Sleeping on
this purple pillow?
Yeah.
Sure, some said, no way.
No way, weirdo.
That sounds crazy to me. And others were like,
Yeah.
I don't care. We discussed it and I thought, okay, all right. I'm warming up to it, but ultimately, no.
How long was installed for this one?
This one, similarly, it was about a day. This is a piece by Casper Bosmans.
And then they're laid on the ground in a certain
It was more
way or haphazard.
Some of the pieces seem to be randomly placed. Actually took hours, if not days, to set up in a specific way. So that is another interesting discussion as to whether that is time well spent or not. When the lights go off and there's no one here and there's a guard outside that door making sure no one gets in to move those socks, it brings me a strange joy. And I'm not kidding. To install the telephone, it took 25 people to carry one telephone pole up the stairs. That's possibly an artist going, I got 25 people to carry telephone poles upstairs, which is poor planning on the Hammer Museums. When they built this museum, they should have thought of that ahead of time. I had to take off.
intervention.
I'll see you. Okay. Yeah, great. That was great.
this coca leaf in the mines in order to stay awake. After not being able to export the coca leaf because
drugs are illegal.
Yeah, shipping drugs are illegal, exactly.
I want to, is it weird? I want to eat it. I want to take a bite of it. Wait, a person stands there and strips?
Yeah, and then does a reverse striptease.
How about?
It's a 2-carat diamond ring produced from the ashes of the Mexican architect Luis Barragan. It's too much for you.
It's a little too much.
I love music.
This is the coolest thing I have ever seen.
Is this like one of those relaxation tools? You know, like a white noise machine? Because it's so soothing.
It is.
Wow.
Oft times, though, it's more or less dormant. You know, it's kind of a sleeping piano.
It won't every 30.
Did you press the button or flick the switch?
Flick the switch.
Fuck.
Did I break it?
No, it just has to be reset now.
Yes. So we're closed tomorrow.
So this is the mail of the museum that's been redirected here over the course of the exhibition. It's a work by Mungo Thompson.
Here's my concern.
Okay.
That there are actual pertinent pieces of mail that need to be looked at. Bills, I don't know, someone's jury duty notice. Right at 4:20 every day? 4:20.
What if Will and I decided to send fresh oysters to the museum?
They would have to go here.
Oh.
Well,
I wouldn't.
I'm not going to send them. And this you can touch.
This you cannot touch.
Interesting concept by taking a variety of objects that might not be seen as art and seeing it through the lens of the artist.
I know a lot of people are like, I don't know if this is art. It's definitely art, I would say. I think.
I appreciate the effort. I can't do it. Well, some of them I can do.
They should definitely come see the show. Staring at them for a long time with other people kind of makes it art.
You walk up to something like a suitcase, and you think it's just a suitcase, but it is a suitcase, but it's not.
Also, just the point, or the interesting point, that this like serves as an advertisement for the exhibition. That's kind of my favorite thing about it. I'll do this. Yeah, but I played that because it's interesting to think about faith, art and faith. Western art is a secularized colonial construct, comes out of theological aesthetics. So it's important for me to think about faith, the faith that we place in objects, the framings that invoke that faith or destroy it, I guess. And so now we move on away from the literal definition to Caprow's definition. Alan Caprow advocates for an unartistic or post-artistic approach. For him, art must blur the boundaries between art and life until the boundary no longer exists. For him, life is better than art, so art should strive to become and eventually be life. Quote that I used in that video. Non-art is more art than art. Anything less than paradox would be simplistic, he says. Unless the identity and thus the meaning of what the artist does oscillates between ordinary recognizable activity and the resonance of that activity in the larger human context, the activity itself reduces to conventional behavior. Implication here being conventional behavior, not art. And he doesn't seem to like that reduction to conventional behavior. So it may be interesting if we choose to like it. I'm choosing to like it at this moment. And then Caprow's tragedy. The tragedy of Caprow and other conceptual artists who sought to flee the market and its adverse impact on life and aesthetics is that ultimately they only generated new kinds of commodities for the market. So we have to ask why dematerialized practices and attempts to escape the market so often look like nothing but managerialism. As art expands to include everything that isn't nominally considered art, the practice of the artist reduces to just being a manager, managing all these moving parts and creating value from things that don't need that operation to be imposed on them. The manager is the one who sucks profit out of the worker's labor, so it's not a great model for art, let alone anything. And from this angle, Capral's approach, a disdain for conventional behavior that also vampirically casts that behavior as art, is a bit strange. But most importantly, it's very in line with market values. I don't think he understood this, and it's fairly sad to me. So here's a meme I made. Capra saying, "Help, I embody the market." Do a cross for him. So sad. Okay, so now Francois Leroy, he is a post-structuralist philosopher from France, and he's developed a practice called non-philosophy. He argues that philosophical activity makes dialectical splits. It generates binaries in order to make decisions, both in logic and in more embodied philosophical thought, like phenomenology or something. And these binaries that philosophy relies on are philosophically uninterpretable. The idea being that there are things that philosophy can't explain that it uses to continue replicating itself. So dialectical structure, the structure of the thesis and the antithesis, A and B, call and response, etc. It's transcendent. The idea is that the clash between those two poles creates a new third thing, the synthesis, as Hegel calls it. Dialectical structure is transcendent. It marginalizes and obscures the uninterpretable outside, which is its condition of possibility. So philosophy has these outsides to it that make it possible, but it also treats those outsides as less than, or as somehow completely obscured from human perception. Whether that's true or not is kind of besides the point of its marginalization. And I give some examples from white Western art, like Platonic form, the Kantian noumenon, Heidegger's split between ontic and ontological, Derrida's split between difference and presence. All of these ascribe to this transcendent dialectical form. Two opposites generate a third. But the thing that's creating that conflict is never actually analyzed. It's impossible to analyze within philosophy, and that's why Leroy calls it philosophically uninterpretable, right? Good example, Plato says these eternal, infinite, perfect forms are the true universe, and then everything that we experience is a copy of that. It's a degraded version of it. But we have no knowledge of the forms themselves. We can't say anything about them except that they're perfect and infinite and unchanging. What the fuck, dude? Which is it? Are they perfect and unchanging, or can we not describe them? You pick a side. So to combat these dialectical splits, non-philosophy embraces immanence as opposed to transcendence and seeks closeness with the world rather than distance. And Wittgenstein, who's not a non-philosopher, but had an expansive project of destroying philosophy, he encapsulates the proposal of immanence well when he says that the world is all that is the case. And my observation is that non-philosophy also implies a rejection of the love of knowledge, or maybe a recalibration of the love of knowledge as something that needs to be let go. Like if you love something, let it go. Loving knowledge means discarding it, letting it be free, letting it exist, as opposed to trying to own it or something. But also non-philosophy implies that philosophy needs non-philosophy to comprehend itself. Philosophy's relationship to these uninterpretable outsides that are marginalized within philosophy, that relationship can't be analyzed within philosophy, because to do philosophy means to accept that these outsides can't be touched, but are also perfect, but are also stupid. And it's like, that's not a good way to think. It actually, Deleuze and Guattari say that philosophy stops thinking. It makes it impossible to think because of these kinds of binaries and because of this kind of valuation of the ego and the reason and rationality over the consciousness and simply experiencing the world in a non-judgmental way. So the analog I'm trying to draw is non-philosophy is to philosophy as non-art is to art in Leroy's sense. So art also makes binaries, including the art, non-art binary, and it relies on distinctions that cannot be grasped by art itself. So it requires a system, the system is required to continue regenerating itself and more new concepts ad nauseum. Its assumptions and foundational structures should be challenged because it's fun. A Leroyan non-art seeks closeness with the world rather than distance from and subsuming presence toward the world that art currently provides. World conditions are not uninterpretable outsides that make art possible. And not only are they not uninterpretable outsides, they shouldn't be marginalized. So the negation of philosophy and art, to me, creates a kind of shadow from a future past, the shadow of a people to come, an echo of those who already were, who discard all the neurotic concepts and evil humanist dichotomies. Here's a page from my sketchbook as I was preparing for this class. It says, a specific hell where things are only the struggle against themselves on some Paul Deman shit. For example, art is only the struggle against art, theory is only the struggle against theory, etc. And there's an empty frame. I'm starting to draw again. So. I'm gonna show some examples of good non-art. And one is called Pay Black Time by the artist Rafia Santana from Brooklyn. This is from her homeschool talk.
-I-A. That huge accident, which was really funny. It was like the day Donald Trump got elected, and I was sick, I was in bed, and I was just like miserable, and everybody's freaking out. And of course, every time like white people start freaking out, and there's this thing that's like, oh, we don't know what to do, and we're constantly saying like what to do, but there's also we don't know what to do because y'all made this mess and it's crazy, and we don't know how to get out of it. So what I just did, I was like, okay, y'all want to do something. Donald Trump just got elected. What can you do to like actually physically like help? And for me, I was being very selfish. I was like, I'm sick. I need some soup. Somebody Postmates me. Somebody give me money so I can Postmates me some soup and some NyQuil. And so like 3 different people sent me like $15. So I was like, okay, I did what I needed to do, and I still had money left over. So I was like, okay, who's black or brown and needs like a meal? I'll cover a meal. And a friend of mine was like, oh well, I could use a meal. And someone was like, are you really doing this? Or are you just gonna like buy people meals? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm sitting at home, I'm sick, I have my phone and my computer. Yeah, let's do this. Why not? And so like it just kind of snowballed, and it was just like dollars and dollars coming through my PayPal account, and it just got to a point, and I think it was like a week or two, and it like $4,000 just like came through this account, and I was like, I don't know what, and I'm just like doing these orders to like people all over the U.S. It wasn't just like people that I knew, because they're telling people that they know who need food, and just like coming through me, and I'm just doing these orders on Seamless and Grubhub, because that's like the easiest thing for me to do. It was the easiest, and because like all of these programs like froze my accounts because it looks like fraud, because I'm sending meals like one after another to like people all over the U.S. from like one account. It looks like somebody was like, stealing money and doing some like whole fraud thing. So I think every single program did this, but Seamless and Grubhub, they have a good like customer service, and they like looked into it and they called me up and they were like, oh yeah, we unfroze your account. Seemed pretty cool what you're doing. All right, so that's what I use. It's the easiest, it's most convenient. I didn't have to call them, unfreeze anything. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm on a break. I keep having to go on breaks because the whole exercise of the project was getting people to give money, giving up the funds that needs to be redistributed anyway. We need to balance the scales. And I was taking it upon myself to like sort of redistribute it myself. And it just became this like huge project that of course I can't handle all by myself. And it was like a weird like tie-in situation where I've had to make it into a bigger thing. Like, oh, I've had to either make it a corporation or a nonprofit or something, and I have to like lock it in what it needs to be. So right now I'm like taking a break and just like reorganizing what I want this program to be. Also like the donation slowdown. And it's about the whole point of it was like the magic of getting people to donate. It wasn't so much, oh, I want to get like a grant from this one place. I want like individual people to take the actual like personal responsibility to give up their own funds and redistribute that. So that until I figured that'd be the next thing to find out like a creative way to do that. And also get people to like help me do this project. And so I would like to be able to pay them. I didn't get anybody to help me because like I didn't have any like feasible thing to give back to them except for like, oh, thank you. You helped a lot. So just otherwise, getting people to do things and manipulating people one way or another. I'm really interested in advertisements, and tabloids, especially tabloids, because it makes you like, the whole point of it is to grab you into something that you might necessarily won't always be interested in, but it's like, it'll hook you into, a celebrity you're really interested in, and something about like their money or something, and just using all these combined things to figure out, what we want to make you consume this somehow. Advertisements like candy, so candy wrappers, how to get these.
Yeah, so consider that an ad for her talk. It's excellent talk. She's a great artist. And I love that example because it's not really art. It's just something that, like she said, selfishly came about because she was hungry and sick, and ended up becoming, a really big project. It's really awesome. Yeah, definitely watch that talk. That was the first talk of the 2017 Homeschool Curriculum. That new space, rest in peace. This is another example. I was in a show called Quota at Soil Artist Run Space in Seattle. And the two curators made a kind of unconventional gesture and included a work in the show. The work was called Quota, like the show. And it took place throughout the whole exhibition, but specifically during the opening. White people could only get into the opening if there were 4 people of color for every 1 white person. So that's why this line is so long. Most of these people didn't get in. And the work is about this idea of like the quota, right? The amount of difference that's necessary to engage certain discourses, certain conversations. So the gallery got sued, so we're still figuring this all out. It's ongoing. Someone claimed civil rights, which is fucking ridiculous. But it's all part of the work. I mean, the documents and everything will continue to live on as documentation of this work and its impact. And then after the opening reception, they were really generous, and the quota went down to 1 person of color for every white person. But there were still issues. So it's interesting to think about like white people seeing that work as an impediment to their civil rights. Like that's a lot to process, and a lot of misinformation that they must have had to think that. But yeah, they included this in the show, but not really. So it's not really art. It's just an interesting example of manipulating the dynamics and seeing to what extent will people accept or comply with these restrictions. Like if a white person had bombarded and like tried to get into the show, and I confirmed this with the curators, they wouldn't have stopped anyone. So there was no real barrier. People just sort of complied with the psychological structure that was presented, and anyone could have just walked in. I mean, there was nothing was really stopping y'all. So it's interesting to think about like, in what ways is that analogous to how capitalism works, right? And then a similar example to Rafia's piece by this great artist, Camila Janan Rashid, also based in New York. It's called Spare Change. And she has a description here on her Instagram. Spare Change is happening again at the start of Ramadan on or around May 16th. Last month, several anonymous donors made it possible to give away almost $900. If you'd like to anonymously contribute, DM me. More info on Spare Change below. Spare Change is a small gesture that began informally a few years ago. As a way to share when I've gotten a raise or a grant when budgeting actually goes well and there's enough to spare. I watched my parents give even when they had nothing, and even more when they had just a little bit more. And carrying on their tradition, we have Spare Change. Allah reminds us, I don't know what SWT means, sorry. Reminds us not to hoard in this dunya and to give charitably, because what we possess in wealth is not even ours to begin with. So this is a kind of artistic manifestation of one of the 5 pillars of Islam, zakat. Zakat is give what you can when you have it. And it's interesting to think about, again, Western art is a secularized Christian construct. So it's interesting to think about other Abrahamic disruptions of that, right, in this secularized context. Like this is an explicitly religious piece. Okay, against subsuming life into art. Joseph Beuys's concept of social sculpture treats society itself as the medium for art. His goal was a construction of an artwork that was a total social order. And here's a quote. Every human being is an artist who, from his state of freedom, note that it's his, the position of freedom that he experiences firsthand, learns to determine the other positions of the total artwork of the future social order. From first appeared in English in 1973, or 1974, sorry. Written in 1973. So not only was Beuys a Nazi, but his idea can be seen as a violent gesture of subsumption. People's lives should not be vehicles for your artistic success. Life is not a raw material. So this is a good time to talk about the fact that homeschool is not art. Lots of alternative arts educational curriculums see themselves as social sculptures. I think this is really dangerous because you can fail your students but still create a good artwork that still has value in the market. And that's really not what I'm about. So homeschool is not art, it's just school. That's just something I wanted to note. The original seed of this class started with that gesture to make homeschool not be art, unlike other alternative arts educational models like Bruce High Quality Foundation University in New York, or Anton Vidokel's Night School, Conceptual Oregon Performance School, Autonomous University, University of Hell. There have been a lot of projects, and they're all art. So they all kind of have that same problem, and we wanted to provide a corrective. Whether that works or not is up for debate, but it's made it easier for us to work. There's no grandiosity. There's just emails to write and to respond to, and time to take out of my life to facilitate the project. Art practices are inherently social, so the idea of social practice actually seems somewhat antisocial. Not only do we see the subsumption already mentioned with Boyce's concept of social sculpture, but also the clear implication of social practice is that outside of the art context, these social practitioners wouldn't necessarily engage with those who are in the work or serve as the basis for the work. So any kind of project where white people are engaging people of color as art, the question remains, and it's probably answered in the affirmative. Do you ignore these people outside of art? Most likely, yes. So that's really fucked up. It's like extremely antisocial. Here's Kirby in some cowboy boots. This is meant to represent social practice. Kirby hoovers enemies and becomes, he takes on the properties of that enemy. So if he sucks in a fire enemy, he gains fire shooting skills. And cowboys obviously represent colonialism. Okay, and violence of modernism and the contemporary. So I'm gonna kind of breeze by this really quickly, but actually no, I'll read from the essay. I have some copies of an essay that I wrote last year over there. Feel free to grab one. Black people get them first, so let the black folks get them first. It's an essay about the violence of modernism and the ways that the fetish for thought, like thinking, continues that in the contemporary, both in the context of dematerialization and institutional critique as a new kind of institution. Modernism conceals its own theft of black and brown aesthetics by treating black and brown artists as somehow indebted to the advancements of modern art, both in the past and today embodied in the contemporary. The lie of Western art as autonomously useless is one of the most useful tools of concealment of ongoing white theft. Until the art world comes to a place of accountability, deaccession, and repatriation of artifacts, the condition for art as autonomously useless will never arise. So that's kind of the thesis of this essay. And I also dealt with some of these issues in my first homeschool class in 2016 called Contemporaneity, Building a Better White Supremacy. And that class dealt with the concept of the contemporary as a continuation of modernism's violence. You can find it on our Tumblr, homeschoolpdx.tumblr.com/contempt. There's 4 sessions. We had a couple of different classes that year, including Mom Art by Victoria, the class that was kind of conceptualized as the opposite of pop art. Mom Art is the opposite of pop art. And I think a lot of the focus on nourishment in that class and the domestic and recalibrating the domestic definitely influenced this class. So I just want to shout out Victoria. Mom Art is at that same Tumblr /MOMART. Oh, funny enough, the 4th Mom Art class was by Jamandria, and she presented the seed of Black Apotrop. So wow, it all comes together. Okay. So I want to provide, before I read from this, a kind of reductive gesture about the violence of modernism. Kazimir Malevich painted the Black Square in 1914 or 15. It was seen as the pinnacle of the contemporary at that time and still today. It's been one of the most influential art pieces of all time. The Black Square represents emptiness and the sublime. It represents the impossibility of the image, the rejection of the image, the rejection of visuality, at least according to the way that this piece has been canonized. But a couple of years ago, X-ray and spectral analysis revealed that there were different layers under the painting. There was a Cubo-futurist painting of Russian peasants, which we see in Malevich's later works, like some of his final paintings are paintings of peasants. And then under that layer, we see a proto-suprematist composition of triangles, crosses, different. If you guys know Malevich, you know what the suprematist compositions look like. It doesn't really matter. And then under that, they found the original black square, which of course is a black square. And then under that, a caption appropriated from Alphonse Allais, who was the founder of Les Arts Incohérents, the Incoherent Arts Group, which was the proto-Dada group that really made possible European modern art. They presented things like socks and eggs and the Mona Lisa with a mustache penciled in as art, but also as non-art. And so that was kind of the beginning of contemporary art in the West. So Malevich, as he was planning the black square and theorizing about it, he was seeing a connection between Les Arts Incohérents and the contemporary and the rejection of the image, right? And he was trying to draw an analog between the impossibility of the image and the racist joke of Alphonse Allais. And so this is the original piece that he's citing. It's from 1887, I believe, and the caption is, Negroes fighting in a cave in the night. Extremely racist. So this is supposed to be the genesis for this, right? So there's no disconnect between extremely anti-Black racism and modern art in the sense that we think of it today. These are extremely linked. Malevich knew it. He was referring to it. The way we know this is that the bottommost layer of the black square had pencil marks on the bottom in Russian with this same caption. So there's no confusion or arbitrariness here. He's very much thinking about the incoherent artists and the beginnings of Dada as in some sense related to the suprematism. I've also always thought about that pun, suprematism. It's just like, that doesn't seem accidental either. But yeah, so this was found to be the origin of the black square. So my opinion is throw it all away. Throw all of modern white art away. Doesn't matter. Nobody cares. It's stupid. It sucks. Throw it out. Fuck it. And then this essay kind of picks up on some of those themes. It is long as fuck, so I'm not sure how much of it I'm going to read. But let's just start. It's called Against the Supremacy of Thought. Do you remember when people misheard the words fuck that on the chorus of Kendrick Lamar's ADHD as fuck thought? Well, fuck thought, kind of. Let's talk about it. First section is called Reanalyzing the Thought Fetish. By means of lack of reason, with religion, language, appearance, and other aspects serving as a litmus, the animalization of Black and brown people has been a critical tool of domination invented to justify the white conquest, genocide, slavery, and other violence that engenders the contemporary. What does it mean then that today art prizes reason and thinking, as well as the aesthetics of thought, such as criticality, divestment from the sensory, and a demeanor of philosophical objectivity? The white West used these very criteria to dehumanize the global South and facilitate European expansion. In a specifically aesthetic context, modernism itself was premised on the spoils of this imperial conquest. Let me actually pull up the tab so you guys can follow. Just posted on Rhizome. Imperial conquest. Despite clarion calls of posthumanism, it is possible to excavate an exclusionary humanism and the fetishism for objective philosophical thought in contemporary art, which preserves the modernist dynamic of treating Black and brown people and aesthetics as raw material. We can recalibrate our definitions of art from the contemplation and production of beautifully useless and self-referential objects. A continued utilitarian project of the violent subsumption of non-white aesthetics is possible through reading Alan Caprell's concept of post-art in the context of the Middle Passage and its afterlife. So you can see that some of these ideas are building on the video essay that I played before. I wrote that first, and then as me and a few other people like Winslow, LaRoche, Radim Petaway, and Rafia Santana talked, some of these ideas continued to grow. Part two, the contemporary. David Doslet defines the contemporary as a mode of aesthetic governance, relegating marginal practitioners into a position of debt to modernism. For Joslet, this imposition of debt mirrors governance by debt in neocolonialism, rendering what he calls heritage or local context merely a dividend of debt, serving to diversify the market, the art market, and globalize its structural tropes, such as painterly abstraction, the white cube, the biennial, etc. The exhibition et al., the concept of art et al. Joslet's analytic is useful for unearthing not only the originary violence of modernism with respect to Black and brown aesthetics, but also the ways the contemporary continues this project of subsumption. Aesthetic governance by debt allows the increasingly marketized art world to commoditize difference and deploy it for its own ends, whether financial, nationalist, or otherwise. Yoked under modernism, marginal artists must assimilate to standard aesthetics and allow themselves to be deployed in service of institutionality. At a deeper level, aesthetic governance by debt allows art to deny modernism's own constitutive debt to Black and brown aesthetics, which it used and uses as raw material to shirk the constraints of earlier white art, such as three-point perspective and objecthood. Thus, the contemporary is an echo of modernism, continuing the edict of modernism while developing new forms of governance over marginalized artists. 3, the end of art. In the afterlife of conceptualism, thinking overcame and reframed making and embodied a Hegelian assumption of teleological human evolution, such that Western society outgrew the stage at which art is the supreme mode of our knowledge of the absolute. Hegel says, quote, "We have got beyond venerating works of art as divine and worshiping them. Thought and reflection have spread their wings above fine art," unquote. That's from Lectures on Aesthetics. During Western industrialization, art's independence on the sensory caused it to fall behind thought as the highest vocation and prime engine of knowledge, whose, quote, again from Hegel, very essence is to go from the observable to the non-observable, from the immediate to the mediate. For Hegel, human cultural developments like art and religion are vestigial forms reflecting an older dependence on the sensory before the modern mastery of nature represented by industry. So industrialization here is a kind of replacement of sensory or mastery over it. For Hegel's teleology, art is over but remains a necessary step in human development. Aesthetic contemplation and production indicate the gradient between human and non-human, setting the stage for white reason to flourish. It is precisely the intimate revelry of the sensory which, when refined, allows for this philosophical flight into the immaterial, the theoretical, and the non-sensory. Without art, philosophy could not have arisen. Is it legible? I'll zoom in just in case. Conceptualist gambit. By dint of art's putative necessity to human development, conceptualism attempted to salvage the patrimony of Western art by ushering thought itself into the set of available artistic mediums. From this lower position, modernist aesthetics works to expand the boundaries of what could be institutionalized as art. Conceptualism went further and deployed the autonomous inutility of the Western art object inherited from modernism to show how, as Alan Kaprow states, art has served as an instructional transition to its own elimination by life. And that's from the same essay, Education of the Unartist. While this may have partly emerged from idealistic notions of thought as a medium, precluding subsumption into the commodity form, the result was that the subject and role of art, which for Kaprow was the ritual escape of culture, simultaneously subsumed and supervened on the social political, becoming instead a kind of immaterial or diaphanous residue which could coat any imaginable life context. In modernism, the idea that anything could be art was scandalous, whereas in conceptualism, this indeterminacy became mundane. With art more deeply yoked to culture, art became a toolkit for interacting with the lived conditions of humanity, akin to a social science or a school of thought. The modernist decline of art's primacy versus thought resulted in the simultaneous expansion of art to whatever, the reduction of art to commentary on world affairs and meta-comments on its own history, and the valorization of thought as the ideal medium for aesthetic practice in this new context. Kaprow's concept of post-art exemplifies this, blurring the line between art and life, since non-art is more art than art. Whatever a person wants to get out of art, life has more of it, and art's duty is to take on a managerial relationship to the sensory by existing in a state of fluidity, even precarity, and in this ephemeral state it haunts life, folds all of life into it. With this vastly expanded aesthetic field, thought as artistic medium engenders a process of art mimicking the disciplines of thought, namely science and philosophy. It is instructive to consider a work that exemplifies the conceptualist gambit of folding thought into the set of available artistic mediums, with this resultant valorization of reason and philosophical aesthetics. Irish artist Michael Craig Martin's is 53 centimeters off the ground with an accompanying text. The work was first shown at the Rowan Gallery in London in 1974. In Q&A format, the text explains the artist's process of, quote, changing a glass of water into a full-blown oak tree without altering the accidents of the glass of water. The oak tree resulting from this metaphysical alteration will not ever have any other form but that of a glass of water. And when pushed to answer the question of where the art is, Craig Martin states in the text that this resulted oak tree is the art object. Picture of the work. Text down there. An oak tree plays on the Aristotelian supremacy of essence over accident. The essence of the oak tree persists, despite all the sensory evidence to the contrary. This ostensible transformation is not aesthetically accessible, and therefore the particular oak tree represented to the audience has no aesthetic dimension at all. Rather, the aesthetic dimension is entirely accidental to the essence, which is intended for gallery display. The former, the essence, or the presentation, is a glass of water. The latter, the essence, is an oak tree. The work also reflects the artist's Catholic upbringing, drawing on the concept of transubstantiation. At the Last Supper, quote, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. In communion, Catholics ceremonially consume a cracker and wine to signify the bread and wine, which at the Last Supper was in essence the flesh and blood of Christ. Despite the accidents of the bread and wine, with this shade of meaning, the artist intends to deconstruct the work of art in such a way as to reveal its single basic and essential element, belief that is the confident faith of the artist in their capacity to speak, and the willing faith of the viewer in accepting what they have to say. In other words, belief underlies our whole experience of art. An oak tree is a fine example of this conceptualist gambit and its vaunting of thought. It simultaneously extricates itself from the abject sensory world and more deeply yokes itself to it, since after all of this metaphysical transformation from a glass of water into an oak tree, the sensory dimension still indicates only a glass of water. In dissecting the social contract between artist and audience, it speaks to contemporary art as a secularized iteration of an originally theological endeavor, one which served as a litmus for humanity. It's an example of Picasso copying African aesthetics. This is the original from the Congo. And this is Picasso's. As we all know, Picasso was very inspired by African features, which he saw as a distortion of human features. Cartesian dualism and anti-Black animalization. The concept and value of thought in the West belie a desire for divestment from the ostensibly inferior world of sensory phenomena, in line with Cartesian mind-body dualism, where bodies are organic machines and only humans with reason and language have souls. As Descartes claims, non-human animals are simply one more facet of nature, ripe for use. Quote, they have no mental powers whatsoever. It is nature which acts in them according to the disposition of their organs. Just as we see that a clock consisting only of ropes and springs can count the hours and measure time more accurately than we can in spite of all our wisdom. According to this idea, a body can only supersede the machinic laws of nature with rational thought. All else serves as the sandbox in which to perfect reason, living and breathing but nevertheless objectified. In this way, Cartesian dualism demonstrates that the practical elaboration of making a commitment to humanity is in humanism. Humanism is by definition a project to amplify, I think he means here expand, the space of reason. Humanism's project to expand the scope and analytic power of reason requires a corollary, dehumanized faction to serve as its foil and ground of deployment and raw material. Building on Cartesian dualism, Hegel argues that, quote, in Negro life, the characteristic point is the fact that consciousness has not yet attained to the realization of any substantial objective existence. What we properly understand by Africa as the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit, still involved in the conditions of mere nature, and which had to be presented here only as on the threshold of the world's history. Hegel frames his mention of Africa as perfunctory, but his portrayal of blackness as primordial is a necessary assumption for his teleological understanding of history, which evolves toward European reason. Hegel transfers Descartes' human-animal dichotomy to the realm of human difference and positions Africa as an inhuman prehistory without thought in order to naturalize slavery and conquest in the development of the West. That's from his lectures on history. In art, we find a similar process. It was and is through the animalization of Black and brown people as lacking reason that white artists can render non-white lands, aesthetics, and bodies as raw material to modify and deploy in response to Western art history, both conceptually and materially. By confining Black bodies to what Orlando Patterson terms social and ontological death, the West could render us simultaneously as the fungible cornerstones of its program and as valueless vestiges of prehistory. As Morel states, the stolen objects that served as the inspiration for modernism, quote, were treated as artifacts of colonized cultures rather than as artworks, and held so little economic value that they were displayed in pawn shop windows and flea markets, unquote. Armed with the fruits of conquest, white art developed away from representation and eventually objecthood entirely by means of positing the supremacy of thought, surfing on colonial spoils. Picasso, for example, said African sculptures had helped him to understand his purpose as a painter, which was not to entertain with decorative images, but to mediate between perceived reality and the creativity of the human mind. The same tendency continues today with Black and brown life inspiring white art, with non-white artists strategically included to absolve the white cube and diversify the market. In response to the squalor of phenomena, art turned the lived into solely a surface for thought, thinking itself as the best medium for art when the entire universe is accessible as source material, which allows a performative divestment from modernist values, while simultaneously arguing for the value-neutral availability of its tools in the newly managerial aesthetic practice. The vaunting of thought in the contemporary, in which criticality is a prime currency, can be read as an echo of Cartesian disavowal of the sensory. In various histories of conquest, this acts as a defensive response to the excavation of the violence of modernism and of art history more generally. This is perfectly in line with the speculative turn in global financial capitalism and its various projects of governance by debt, brutal resource extraction, and sanitized diversity, all of which serve to conceal the constitutive violence of capitalism. Okay, let's move on. There you go. Again, there's copies over there. Grab one if you want. If you can't find one, it's on Rhizome. So yeah, modern art, throw it all away. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Fuck all that shit. So now this idea of the non-autonomy of non-white art. Rejecting Western modernism and contemporaneity's claims of art's autonomy in utility, the position of art as non-autonomous argues that art/non-art is supposed to be functional. And we have two examples here, Paget Henry and Amiri Baraka. Paget Henry has arguments that we'll talk about on the next slide of Afro-Caribbean philosophy and art's non-autonomy from life. And then Amiri Baraka has this quote, "The word art is something the West has never understood. Art is supposed to be part of a community, like scholars are supposed to be part of a community. Art is to decorate people's houses, their skin, their clothes, to make them expand their minds. And it's supposed to be right in the community where they can have it when they want it. It's supposed to be as essential as a grocery store. That's the only way art can function naturally." So this is a quote from Paget Henry. He's an Afro-Caribbean philosopher. "The formation as a whole of Afro-Caribbean philosophy has been the work of ministers, doctors, lawyers, historians, economists, political activists, creative writers, and philosophers all working together." And I'll note that also every other job as well. All kinds of jobs. "This feature points to the intertextual embeddedness of Afro-Caribbean philosophy. Consequently, by no stretch of the imagination can this philosophy be considered an autonomous one. On the contrary, both its politicization and its production by non-philosophers points to its origins in the teleological, foundational, and discursive aspects of life projects being undertaken." And I believe this idea also applies more generally to the African diaspora as a whole, both its philosophy and art. People of all kinds of jobs have contributed to the canon of Black art. There's no specific job of an artist in our communities. It's all about how does the philosophical or the artistic register impact what you do whether it's art or philosophy or not. And that obviously comes out of colonization, which Paget Henry talks about. African art and philosophy being forced to live underground in conventional behavior, as Capra calls it. But it's also an aesthetic decision. It's a decision for protection, for a rejection of network aesthetics as the West conceives of it. So there's multiple, it's not just that Afro-Caribbean and Afro-diasporic art and philosophy are forced to be in secret. It's also that there's an aspect to that which is exciting and positive, and hiding in plain sight is relevant. So I have an empty slide here. All good art is non-art. I'm gonna take a second to think about that as I go use the bathroom. I'm not gonna wait for people. This isn't me. Art is in the therapy chair. Non-art is the therapist. Okay. So I was drawing on this sort of famous book, The Artist's Way by Julie Cameron, a spirit of creativity. And I was thinking about what an analog might be, the non-artist way. Is Victoria here? We need to resensitize ourselves to the possibilities outside of or adjacent to the aesthetic. Art isn't a one-stop shop for your ethics, politics, theory, and style. It's an industry that naturalizes market logic for all of those things. Here's a quote from Asmodeus from an essay they wrote called On Hating Art from Moss Ultra World in 2017. Hatred of art isn't hatred of beauty. In fact, it's closer to the opposite. It's hatred of capitalism for trying to make us accept the fact that we can only find beauty in art or in some other commodity or commodified experience. The problem with a lot of art world people, though, aside from the obvious problems of being settler colonial pieces of shit, is that they want their participation in the art world to function as a complete package. In other words, you can get your aesthetics, your ethics, and your politics in the same place by doing the same stuff. Your art is your resistance, or your academic research is your resistance, or whatever. Fuck all that shit. It's stupid. Victoria? So Victoria and I are going to do a simultaneous reading. I want this to reflect the spiritual impetus that I've tried to impart on this lecture. Ready? 1, 2, 3. The way is originally perfect and all-pervading. How could it be contingent on practice and realization? The true vehicle is self-sufficient. What need is there for special effort? Indeed, the whole body is free from dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? It is never apparent from this very place. It is never apart from this very place. What is the use of traveling around to practice? And yet, if there's a hair's breadth deviation, it is like the gap between heaven and earth. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. Suppose you are confident in your understanding and rich in enlightenment, gaining the wisdom that knows at a glance, attaining the way and clarifying the mind, arousing an inspiration to reach for the heavens. You are playing in the entrance way, but you are still short of the vital path of emancipation. Consider the Buddha. Although he was wise at birth, the traces of his 6 years of upright sitting can yet be seen. As for Bodhidharma, although he received the mind seal, his 9 years of facing a wall are celebrated still. If even the ancient sages were like this, how can we today dispense with wholehearted practice? Therefore, put aside the intellectual practice of investigating words and chasing phrases, and learn to take the backward step that turns the light and shines it inward. Body and mind themselves will fall away, and your original face will manifest. If you want to realize such, get to work on such right now. For practicing Zen, a quiet room is suitable. Eat and drink moderately. Put aside all involvements and suspend all affairs. Do not think good or bad. Do not judge true or false. Give up the operations of mind, intellect, and consciousness. Stop measuring with thoughts, ideas, and views. Have no designs on becoming a Buddha. How could that be limited to sitting or lying down? At your sitting place, spread out a thick mat and put a cushion on it. Sit either in the full lotus or half lotus position. In the full lotus position, first place your right foot on your left thigh, then your left foot on your right thigh. In the half lotus, simply place your left foot on your right thigh. Tie your robes loosely and arrange them neatly. Then place your right hand on your left leg and your left hand on your right palm, thumb tips lightly touching. Straighten your body and sit upright, leaning neither left nor right, neither forward nor backward. Align your ears with your shoulders and your nose with your navel. Rest the tip of your tongue against the front of the roof of your mouth with teeth together and lips shut. Always keep your eyes open and breathe softly through your nose. Once you've adjusted your posture, take a breath and exhale fully. Rock your body from right to left and settle into steady, immovable sitting. Think of not thinking. Not thinking. What kind of thinking is that? Non-thinking. This is the essential art of Zazen. The Zazen I speak of is not meditation practice. It is simply the Dharma gate of joyful ease, the practice realization of total culminated enlightenment. It is the koan realized. Traps and snares can never reach it. If you grasp the point, you are like a dragon gaining the water, like a tiger taking the mountains. For you must know that the true Dharma appears of itself, so that from the start, dullness and distraction are struck aside. When you arise from sitting, move slowly and quietly, calmly and deliberately. Do not rise suddenly or abruptly. In surveying the past, we find the transcendence of both mundane and sacred, and dying while either sitting or standing, have all depended entirely on the power of the Zazen. In addition, triggering awakening with a finger, a banner, a needle, a mallet, and effecting realization with a whisk, a fist, a staff, or a shout, these cannot be understood by discriminative thinking, much less can they be known through the practice of supernatural power. They must represent conduct beyond seeing and hearing. Are they not a standard prior to knowledge and views? This being the case, intelligence or lack of it is not an issue. Make no distinction between the dull and sharp-witted. If you concentrate your efforts single-mindedly, that in itself is wholeheartedly engaging the way. Practice realization is naturally undefiled. Going forward is, after all, an everyday affair. In general, in our world and others, in both India and China, all equally hold the Buddha seal. While each lineage expresses its own style, they're simply devoted to sitting, totally blocked in resolute stability. Although they say that there are 10,000 distinctions and 10,000 variations, they just wholeheartedly engage the way in Zazen. Why leave behind the seat in your own home to wander in vain through the dusty realms of other lands? If you make one misstep, you stumble past what is directly in front of you. You have gained the pivotal opportunity of human form. Do not pass your days and nights in vain. You are taking care of the essential activity of the way. Who would take wasteful delight in the spark from a flintstone? Besides, form and substance are like the dew on the grass, the fortunes of life like a dart of lightning, emptied in an instant, vanished in a flash. Please, honored followers of Zen, long accustomed to groping for the elephant, do not doubt the true dragon. Devote your energies to the way of direct pointing at the real. Revere the one who has gone beyond learning and is free from effort. Accord with the enlightenment of all the Buddhas. Succeed to the samadhi of all the ancestors. Continue to live in such a way that you will be such a person. The treasure store will open itself and you may enjoy it freely. Cool. That's it. Thank you. Okay. Do people have questions or anything?
Curious about the empty slide, like what people have to say about the author, big art, and so on.
What do people have to say about that? What do people have to say about the empty slide whose headline was "All good art is non-art"? Mm-hmm.
I think it kind of shows the acuity of words about art.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think art is about experiencing something. The words about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that the slide basically not showing anything, which I think a lot of the words about art do. They don't show anything. In a lot of cases, don't even really illuminate. They can be useful as a big way into something sometimes. But for Wittgenstein, the first line of the Tractatus, his later philosophy changed a lot from that kind of binary opposition, which is what pathological positivism in the 20th century. The language games in the 50s. But he did say that near the end of the Tractatus, that what seems best to happen is that you use the metaphors like the ladder. And
he talks about
the ladders away. That's when thing actually happens. So I think talking about art is an interesting thing to do, but I think experiencing it is probably important, regardless of how you define it, or somebody else defines it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a way in which language is a value creator that we are afraid to talk about. And a lot of the decisions that people make to treat language as art in the art world context are about generating value, right? So I completely agree with you. And I'm interested, you brought up Wittgenstein's radical shift to ordinary language philosophy. For those who haven't read him, don't bother, but the idea of ordinary language philosophy and we don't all have to agree.
Philosophical investigation.
He's actually my favorite philosopher, so I'm just being facetious. But in the philosophical investigations, he completely got rid of his earlier philosophy and even, I would say, got rid of systematic thinking in general and approached life and thinking in a much more embodied way, letting his experience determine his ideas. And in this book, he talks about how everything is based on language games. So if we're going back to this idea of the binary concepts that are built into the philosophical or the artistic, Wittgenstein really eradicates those because he says that the only relationships between different concepts is one of family resemblance, right? So A and B, the relationship between them is based on small differences and similarities, right? And this is very much analogous to the idea of philosophically uninterpretable assumptions. Like the relationships between concepts can't be explained in philosophy itself. So we look to the outside. We look to ordinary life. We look to how people use language. Meaning is use. It's just the way that people use it, right? And my definition of non-art is very Wittgensteinian. It's non-art is whatever people call a non-art, right? There's no.
Just like art is
Exactly.
Art is anything I find it more useful.
Can you say why?
because art is what artists do. Relies on the use of the word artist, which can be a self-given appellation. I'm an artist.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I'm about to say applies to me.
There's so many things that
That's the point. And art is what artists do, the same way that mathematics is what mathematicians do.
Unless
that
it's not.
doesn't make breakfast mathematics. In art, it's the same thing. Art is what artists do when they are doing art.
Yeah. But you haven't answered why it's a more useful definition.
I find it socially more useful. I think it lends itself to better critiques of social environments, better critiques of how their world works, and Dickey's institutional analysis of art, which is part of anything that gives a frame around it, and in a gallery is art. I mean, I think that it's behavior-based, it's not philosophy-based. And I think that ultimately is more useful for analyzing human behavior. Start someplace that's behavior-based as opposed to possibly misleading ideas.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that slide, as much as I might agree with it based on the context or how I feel at the moment, the reality is that it's meant to exemplify like the uselessness of these kinds of universalist phrases, like all good art is non-art. It doesn't really mean anything, right? So that's why it's an empty slide. It's supposed to kind of exemplify how useless these totalizing phrases and ways of thinking about art are that we generally see in Western periodizations of the contemporary, right? First we had Cubism, then we had Futurism. It's like it doesn't mean anything, right? It's just a way of people to insert themselves into the historical narrative and to keep validating these arbitrary aesthetic developments as like the canon, right? It's like it's not useful at all.
Can we talk about like religion and religion as regards to the construction of art, as it is like a purely theological thing at this point? And so, like, because we kind of touched on it and we talked about how you've done that, so I don't know if you want to talk about the big thing, but that's like the big message. I agree with this a lot of times. You know, but it is religious.
Totally.
And it's like theological. It's about belief. It's not about like some kind of science. You know, so I think we'll touch on that.
Sure. Well, I think the ways that we engage art, all of those different behaviors are sublimated theological behaviors. They're behaviors of worship and contemplation, right? Mark Rothko has a literal chapel. This is not an accident. So not only are all of these behaviors taken from a theological context and have been secularized, but also on top of that, there's this issue of like, art is about belief in that object, context, the process that you see in front of you, right? If I believe that something's art, it's art, right? And so I think the relevance of that in a secularized context is that we see the echoes of where art came from, right? We see these past ways of engaging the aesthetic that haunt us, and we're in a context where, you know, theology and religion is not cool, but spirituality is cool. Spirituality in the sense of Sheela Islam, right? People pick and choose from different traditions and create their own individual spiritual paths, right? That's why I had Victoria read from The Artist's Way, A Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity. Sheelaism is this idea. Two sociologists studied a woman named Sheela who invented her own religion, essentially, and they saw her as an embodiment of the modern religious impulse. It's very isolated and individualistic. It's not so much about communities of practice and community rituals. So that seems like something that can only arise in a context where art and aesthetics are secularized, right? They've lost the theological connective tissue that makes them communal, that makes them, like Amir Baraka says, something that should be always available whenever the community needs it, right? It should be as available as the commodities that we have access to now. course there's not. I mean, the language, the way we talk about it, the work itself, right? When you present things out of context, they have this power over people that don't have access to that context, right? And that, I feel like that's an important part of the way that art works in the West today. Like, again, going back to the Will Ferrell and Joe McHale video, like, they had no context for that, so they were acting like idiots in front of the work. I love that. That to me is like the most resounding experience of art. Right, not Puritan. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is like right now, art is still modern. You know, and so it's postmodern. It's the Catholic.
Absolutely.
It's so this homeschool operates like very reality instead of art as religion. So I don't know.
I was raised puritanical Pentecostal, so clearly that's had some sort of influence on the way I think and my kind of aniconic approach to art. Like, I'm not that into visuality at all. I'm also not that into conceptuality at all. I think it's like kind of boring. So it's funny that I'm doing a class about things that are non-artistic or post-conceptual, right?
But I think it was very well because we both participate in iconography and like.
But it's different though.
Is like, you know, there is like object magic, and then there's like you can be like surrealism, experimentality, like there is like a religious cadence and how consciousness is iterated over objects, and so like that's in your work where it's like my consciousness over this object is the holy thing, and that is something that translates from like religious upbringing into terminal art. If that resonates, and then I think what happens. A lot of people who are not raised in that kind of mystic tradition of like religion, like they kind of come to experimentality with the same way. It hits them with the same way the first time you got hit with the spirit, and it's supposed to like knock you out.
Ego death.
You don't fall out, and then the first time you do fall out, that caught up. Like experimentality hits some people like that when they haven't had that like foundational in the mystical consciousness of like. So
absolutely,
like a lot of like when you do iconography, you're coming with that like mystical interpretation. It's like so much theory is mysticism and so much academia is religion, because that's the roots of all of these things. And that's like coming through in your work, and that's coming through in how you engage with objects and engage with the value of art and not art. In that like every living thing is a work of art.
But that's not even relevant, right? It's like every living thing is an artist, but also who cares?
Yeah.
Like what's the next?
What's the next?
Yeah. How do they all get access to the same stuff that we feel we have access to?
To the sense that everyone, because not everyone has access to that.
Exactly.
Not everyone is understood to be and cannot understand outside of that not being seen to be that living. So, like how do you slow down all of that variance?
I think there's this, if we're following this thread, that the secularized notion of art that we have today has roots in Catholicism and its expansive iconography versus the aniconic Puritan tradition. It's interesting to think about people who like are lapsed Catholics in that sense, like people who are not puritanical in the same way that I might be, but are like dissatisfied with what's presented to them in the decadence of the post-Catholic Western art context, right? Like,
but still reliant
upon it.
Still engaged with. It's still this kind of what else is there? Oh.
Right, it's something that generates this ennui and that generates this like essentially white mediocrity and like.
Yeah, it's just what is there?
Aliens.
A lot of stuff is aliens. That's like
yeah.
That is true.
Yep. That's fucking hilarious. Yeah, Universalist Unitarians, right? Right. That's David Josselet's lecture on heritage and debt is a lot about that and the ways of like managing difference, treating difference as like part of the national project, part of the market, part of lay people's life, like vernacular society, right? So it's like what we consider, we're talking about now, like venerating community aspects and venerating ancestor worship and stuff like that. All of that is treated as like brujeria, I guess, or as like devil's work or something, right?
It's just very like
right.
certain specials like not history and theology.
Mhm.
Because those are because a lot of the spiritual the African religions are like very dense. The ontologies of the African religions are dense, and it goes directly against the construction of it, which is
Heavily.
animistic spirits and all the things and like in the water and like I'm like
Mhm.
like Euclid is wild.
I mean, if we even just take this like essential Yoruban concept of like the ego and consciousness are always at war,
Right.
Yeah,
it's
as opposed to the Freudian like sedimentary model of like they're layers on top of each other. No, they're actually always talking to each other and always at war. And our rational ego.
As well, it's like because outside of the ancestors, like there's like no end to the time of like ancestors.
Right, it's circular.
Yeah, it's circular.
Yeah.
It's like also present. There's also a meditative aspect. The different aspects have a lot to do with also the cycle of the soul. There's like far more complicated than like Western like stuff, and as well as like tantra.
Mhm. Well, the goals are different.
Yeah, but the goals are different, but it's like the same kind of moving energy.
If your goal is colonization, then of course this framework is going to be a lot simpler. Yeah.
Because you got to make it look like people
Don't have humanity at all.
But at the same time, like we were talking about like I think it's kind of scary to me how much like most white art institutions understand themselves as secular.
Mhm.
Like the way that people think that because you are away from that. And so like I would really like it if most like white artists understood that the only way through your whiteness is like to acknowledge that like this is about faith and belief. This is about nothing scientific and theoretical. It's like it's as fungible as what you think the Bible thumpers are at, And it's like if you don't believe in magic or spiritual possession, like I don't know, I don't really like know how to do it. Have disengaged from whiteness, like a spiritual process in regards to white art, and then it's like turning all white art into non-art. Basically, it's understanding that all white art is non-art at this point.
Right.
At this point, and especially if you believe there's history and iterating, at this point, to really try and engage with decolonizing, all white art has to become non-art on a certain level. Or it's all art only by the belief of like, the colonies.
Right, in the Capro sense on art.
Yeah, it's just like that. Like it's just something that's happening. That you have to give up like consent to whether you're making it real to like this space that has been eliminated under the blocks for cooking or whatever the hell, or like for like Joseph Putin's fascist nonsense,
right?
Garbage, all these like Nazis and modernism, very coded Nazis, like that has to be paid for in that now.
It wasn't coded. It wasn't coded at all.
It's not even coded. That's just like that's the Nazis, not just that.
As interesting as his work might be, he was a full-blown Nazi. Like, there's nothing is concealed about it.
You are a Nazi.
Or that you can use the euphemism collaborationist. He's a fucking Nazi. Boys is German.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he had mental issues, no question. I'm never gonna blame him for that.
It's like obviously evil. Like, it's obviously wrong.
Any other comments, criticism, questions, commentary?
Just like thinking about like myself and my own goals, I think this was in some ways really validating.
Mm-hmm.
So I make clothes, and often the purview of fashion is sort of sits outside of the purview of art. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're starting to see clothes in museums and starting to become taken seriously with real thing that exists that has meaning, but like often it sort of sits like sort of between commerce and craft, and then like art is like all these other things.
Outside of it?
What's that?
Outside of it somehow?
Right, but like sort of in terms of like how people think about how to do it. And so for me, it's interesting is sort of like I think like in a way that like sort of making of clothes can be like a good way of doing not art because you're making real stuff for real people that has a function and can be engaged with. And like I don't know, I think this is an interesting thing of way of like looking at it and just like totally personally validating, hey, like this can be valuable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think fashion is a great example of like the fragility of non-art as a concept. Non-art is so antagonistic, but also indebted to these histories of exit from art, rejection of visuality, but also through that rejection, generating a new kind of artistic or aesthetic commodity, right? So fashion is definitely like one of the best examples of that because I completely agree with you theoretically. Like people need clothes, and the people that make the clothes should make them and give them away, and you know get paid directly by the consumer. But the reality is, we live in like a world where fashion is one of the best commodities, and it's like it exemplifies the commodity form because the clothes we wear describe us. They describe our personalities and our aesthetics. In reality, they're just describing our consumer positions, in my mind at least. But at the same time, there are people that are making clothes that are doing radical things. Like I'm thinking of Victoria's wearing a shirt by No Cesso. Oh, it's a collaboration. But it's an example of an organization that they make clothes and they give some of their money away. And their clothes are for marginalized people, Black and brown people, queer people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but non-art is supposed to be functional, but being functional isn't enough, I guess is what I would say. Like there has to be more intent to the functionality. Like it can't just be, it works. It has to work against the norm. Like Rafia or Camila Janan Rashid's pieces, they work against the norm, right? They feed Black and brown people. They take money from white. They don't even take it. They ask for money. It's like such a nice thing.
Good art, like as far as possible with them, and like in a constant. But like if you're not, somehow it's like the way to do that.
You fall back into it. Well, because it's an ongoing process. Like nothing is ever, everything is iterative. Like you don't just go to sleep as a decolonizing person and wake up the next day. Like you have to continue that process every day. We wake up having forgotten everything we knew from before, and we fall right back into our default because that's how biology works. Like you wake up and I'm angry and need coffee and hate everything and don't want to live. Right, that's my day. But eventually, you have to find a way to create discipline with yourself and create a contemplative framework for self-critique and for recalibrating how you react and react to, react against, and help the world. Or not help. You don't have to necessarily help, but hopefully you want to. So yeah, I think there's a degree to which it's not good enough that non-art is a rejection. Like a rejection isn't good enough anymore or something. It's a rejection has been commodified. So, that's interesting though.
I liked that slide too, and I thought it was also because it had that one bullet point, and then the rest is the open field.
So clearly something is there.
The functionality of that statement too, it's in, it's part of the aesthetic statement. And then it's kind of like it's stopped, but it's also like
Mhm. Yeah, I guess the takeaway is stop making work. I mean, give your money away, give your property away, give your land away. Stop. Let's go back to Demian's fucking tote. Abandon the concept of gender identity. Abandon the concept of country. I don't remember the words. I'm going to pull it up. But I feel like it really, I put it in the fake garage because it exemplifies a lot of my beliefs. Abandon the concept of gender identity. Abandon the concept of sexual orientation. Abandon the concept of fear. Abandon the concept of your country. Like, so much of the work that needs to happen is internal and is ideological and immaterial in a way that makes it really easy for people to negate it and say, oh, that doesn't need to happen. Because you can't even touch it. Like, you can't grasp. So I don't know. It's important to accept that the horizon of dematerialization is not just aesthetic, but also political. We need to dematerialize ourselves, right? As whether you're a settler or a visitor or a combination of both. Like, yeah. Okay, last comments? We're a little over time, so.
I was thinking about throughout all the discussions, this category, art. What's its history? Like, the idea of the art has to be used. This is
Western.
Yeah, but I mean that category is used to shore up and in some cases invoke certain structures that do specific things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not random. It's a pattern. Tease it out. And so that, to me, that's just always an interesting question. I guess it's like, what does this thing do?
Right.
What are the consequences of us believing in this thing, treating it as a real thing? It's a category.
How does the belief hide what it does?
Yeah, I mean, there's often a little smoke screen. There's a bunch of layers and smoke screens. Often, but when you look at like what is actually happening, I think it's harder for the smoke screens to work.
I agree. I feel like there's a lot of mystique around the decolonization of art, and I don't understand why. It's like, this stuff is not secret. Picasso openly expressed that he stole from African art, that he saw African features as distorted human features. So it's like, it's not, there's no secrecy here. It's out in the open. People don't want to do the research. That's fine. Don't do the research, but just be aware.
That's why the mystique is there, is precisely to keep people from seeing that.
Hmm.
It's like part of the whole game, you know? I think it's intentional.
But that doesn't make sense to me, because isn't there so much potential market-wise in accepting that Picasso was a colonizer? Or am I wrong? Like, I feel like
yeah, possibly.
If we've seen the trajectory of non-art, we've seen that linguistic work, dematerialized work has a lot of market value.
Yeah.
So why do we still have to hold on to these canonized colonizers? Like, it doesn't make sense to me.
I mean, maybe, I don't know, I don't have the answer, but I'm speculating maybe.
Is it just because the work is beautiful or whatever? It's visually.
No, I mean, I'm saying maybe there's other power structures beyond just the marketability. So, like, yeah, you're right. Marketability alone doesn't explain it, but maybe there's deeper power structures. Marketability is just a symptom of.
Name one.
That means that's
No, it's easy. Racism.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Patriarchy.
Even deeper than that, almost, is oppression written large, colonization. I'm even like wondering if there's a deeper one for that, like equations.
Right.
I don't have the, that's what I don't have the answer to. But these kind of things, and if that kind of
right.
If that supports that, I mean, you can maybe take a little bit of a loss in the marketability, but you're still supporting that stuff.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we all know that racism and patriarchy aren't productive market-wise. We spend money to do these things. Like, I was thinking about this kid who hopped a turnstile in New York before hopping a turnstile was decriminalized. They sent 4 helicopters to look for this kid. 4 helicopters, millions of dollars within an hour spent to find this one kid who hopped a $3 fare. Exactly. It's like, how is that market logic at all? It's not. Something deeper is happening, right? And I don't know enough about Europe and old Europe, but like Europe has always been at war with itself. So I almost feel like when Europe started the colonization process in 1441, there was a projection of that self-warfare, and specifically a projection of Islam versus Christianity, right? And the Moors and the Jews versus the Catholics. And it's this ongoing, constantly recirculating blood feud that it hurts everyone. Literally the entire world has suffered from this shit. And it's like, exactly, just give it up. Why can't you just give it up? Like, you can't give it up because all of these other concepts come from it. Art and pleasure and aesthetics and value. And so we can't give those up. It's like we're attached to them in an ancestral way, right?
I think that's what it is. I mean, we think of this as being concepts that are very Western. I think it's likely the colonization goes back to whatever we want to call it.
Right. Rome, whatever.
I mean, I feel like it just older than Rome.
And all this being said, we don't need to go back that far. Today, we can undo all of this without looking at history. It's just important to like know where we're coming from as settlers or visitors. Like this is not new, right? But we can still come up with new solutions for it, or ways of dismantling our own access. Right? We can't. Oh, look, it would be great if we could. I wouldn't exist without colonization, and I would gladly have that happen. Like, I'll take one for the team. Undo all of it. Like, that'd be great. Exactly. The pixels. Thanos. All right, we're way over time, so I'm calling it. We're done. Thank you.